on you. It's Mac tonight. Come on.
Have you ever seen this face? What about this one? Or this one? All of these people are victims found within the FBI's Violent Crime Apprehension Program, otherwise known as VICAP. These photos are reconstructions of people far gone from this world, obtained from crime scenes with remains either too old or too damaged to identify. Through artist depictions or physical reconstruction, investigators managed to render the faces of people who are otherwise unrecognizable. Ordinary people who, in their death, have been robbed of their identities. They lie beneath tombstones that read either John or Jane Doe. While I was on the internet the other day, I came across the FBI's VICAP site, and needless to say, it really freaked me out. There's something really uncanny and horrifying about these pictures, and they only got worse the more that I looked into them. Because as scary and spooky as creepy pictures on the internet are, they're suddenly a lot more horrifying when they're connected to something real. Every set of eyes that you see here are those of someone who has been murdered, beaten, tortured, kidnapped, or assaulted in ways that we can't imagine. After everything that they go through, they're quite literally unidentifiable. And that's a thought that I'd never really had before. And needless to say, after I looked at all of this, it made my skin crawl. So today, with it being spooky season, I thought I'd do something a little bit different and share some of the stories of the unidentified. On April 9th, 1989, the remains of a middle-aged man were found by a farmer in a tobacco barn off of Kentucky 22, about 7.5 miles west from the nearest town of Dry Ridge. This victim was shot twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon, and all of his clothes and any identifiable pieces of information were completely stripped from his person. Most disturbingly, though, whoever had killed this man had removed both of his hands, most likely in an attempt to prevent fingerprint identification. This victim was found completely naked, with no wallet or driver's license. His hands were completely gone, so there was no way of identifying him via fingerprint, and to further add to this, investigators estimated that the man was killed roughly 2 weeks prior to their discovery. His face was decomposing. He was unrecognizable. Even more bizarrely, though, the man still had several defining characteristics that should have helped him stand out. It was noted that he had something called flat head syndrome, where the back of his skull was really flat. Investigators also noted that he had extensive dental work done. Some people online hypothesized that this man used to be a soldier or a boxer, as he stood at 6'4" and had a rather athletic build. In addition, he had several healed facial fractures, which would indicate that he had fought heavily in the past. Whoever this man was, though, and wherever he may have come from, had ceased to exist. He would now simply be referred to as the Grant County John Doe, or less eloquently, the man with no hands. Something about having everything that you've done in your life completely overshadowed by your death is really frightening to me. Typically, when we see a murder case, we look at the victims and we hear their stories, right? And we say, oh, this was a person with a family and people who cared about them, and they just so happened to be unlucky enough to be murdered. But this is so much more tragic because we never hear those stories. These people are effectively removed from existence. There is no trace of their previous lives. Their families have no clue what's happened to them. They're simply gone. Even the photo shown here isn't an actual photo. It is a mere digital rendering of an artist's depiction of what the victim might have looked like. Nobody, except maybe the killer, can say for certain who this man was. On April 13th, 1977, a man and his wife were out scavenging for a pump on their property. Now, the property itself was an old abandoned farm, so there wasn't anyone living on it at the time. It was sort of just overgrown land with an old farmhouse on it. The husband decided that they could probably get this pump from an old septic tank that was around the other side of that farmhouse. However, when he opened it, he was met with something awful. A human foot bobbed in and out of the still mud below. The RCMP were quickly dispatched to the property, and detectives had to take turns emptying the septic tank out with ice cream pails. One officer said that it took them roughly an hour of doing this before they could even start to see the torso. Now, the body itself had decomposed significantly given that it was sitting in a septic tank, and due to this, examiners were unable to identify who this person was. In fact, the body had been so damaged that it was months before they could even identify the victim's gender, let alone an age or a name. After some time, though, the victim was finally identified to be a male, and a clay reconstruction of his face was made. And this victim would later be dubbed Septic Tank Sam. As examinations of the body continued, it became clear the horror that Sam had experienced. He had essentially been tied to a bed and tortured. He was burned with a butane torch. He was beaten and bruised, and it's believed that the perpetrator used a pair of gardening shears to sexually mutilate him. For lack of a better term, it was atrocious. One of the officers working the case said that Sam's killers were cruel and vindictive. This same officer would go on to state that whoever had killed Sam was probably a local, as an outsider likely wouldn't know about the farm or the septic tank even being there. And to the town of Tofield, that was really unsettling. Someone that they walked past every day, someone that they talked to regularly, could have been a stone-cold killer. But due to the circumstances here, they wouldn't find that out. And unfortunately, 47 years later, it seems like they never will. On June 5th, 2014, a road worker discovered two large discarded suitcases lying along a ditch in Geneva, Wisconsin. Inside of these cases were the bodies of two dead young women, each tied up with rope and crammed to fit inside of the tight suitcases. The body of the first woman was quickly identified via dental records as 37-year-old Laura Simonson. However, the other victim wasn't as lucky. It seemed to police that she had been killed quite a while before Laura, and her body had suffered a significant amount of decomposition. Investigators weren't able to pinpoint any defining features, and she would quickly come to be known as the suitcase body. Now, much like some of the other victims shown here today, investigators called in an artist to do a reconstruction of this mystery woman's face, but the results here were horrifying. This is one of the most unsettling images that I've seen in a while, purely because of how uncanny it is. I really don't want to sound disrespectful here, but this really seems like something that you'd see in an analog horror video. It's sort of par the course for that, except it's not an analog horror or an ARG. This is a real person who was taken away from her family. Now, at the time, this was making the rounds online because of how weird it looked, and I can understand why. Police sketches are always pretty eerie and odd to look at, but this one is at a whole nother level. There's something innately depressing to this image, to think that someone's life could be reduced to this. But as sad as it might be, there is a bright side to all of this, because as creepy and unsettling as this picture is, it worked. The woman in the suitcase was later identified as 19-year-old Jenny Gomez. One of her family members just so happened to be watching TV and recognized the features of the drawing to be that of their own family member. And shortly thereafter, the man who killed the two girls, Stephen Zellick, would be arrested. Jenny and her family, years after her death and disappearance, would finally receive justice. Over time, we've started to learn the names of more and more of these unidentified victims. Through forensic genealogy, family members have become relinked to those who were thought to be lost forever. In 2021, Septic Tank Sam was later identified to be 26-year-old Gordy Sanderson, a young man from Manitoba. And the man with no hands is currently undergoing a similar gene matching process as we speak. So I suppose all of this is to say that hopefully sometime in the future, there won't be John or Jane Does anymore. Victims won't be remembered by horrific pictures or crime scene photos, but instead by their smiling faces. And while some might not receive the justice that they deserve, I can find a bit of solace in the fact that their families can at least finally receive closure. If any of you guys are interested in checking this out for yourself, I highly recommend the FBI's VICAP portion of their website. Every active and pending investigation that they have is shown on there, and who knows, perhaps you could be the person to help identify someone whose face has been long forgotten. With all of that being said though, I really appreciate you guys tuning into this very different, very special Halloween episode. Please stay safe out there. You know I love you. I'm out.